Before we start, we'd love for you to share in the comments where you're joining us from and the exact time you're listening to this account. We're always curious to see which corners of the world these documented stories reach, and at what hour. The winter of 1894 delivered more than just the season's bitter chill to Salem, Massachusetts. It heralded the start of what would become one of the region's most baffling and unsettling mysteries. The Hargrove estate, a once admired Victorian mansion on the town's outskirts, stood as a monument to family wealth and standing. Yet, by the following spring, the Hargrove name would be uttered only in whispers, if it was spoken of at all. Eleanor and Margaret Hargrove, unmarried sisters in their 30s, were viewed as eccentric yet upstanding members of Salem society. Their father, Thaddeus Hargrove, had built a fortune in the textile trade before his death in 1886, leaving the sisters to uphold the family's position. They were known for their charitable contributions to the town church and their flawless etiquette, though very few could claim a close acquaintance with them. What renders this case so peculiar is not merely the nature of the events, but how completely they were later scrubbed from the official record. Based on the limited documentation that survives, mostly personal letters and newspaper clippings held by the Essex County Historical Society, the Hargrove affair was intentionally struck from public memory through a systematic purge of evidence. One detail emerges consistently from the scattered reports. The attic of the Hargrove mansion, a room that, according to the architectural plans, filed with the county in 1871, was never supposed to have been there. Dr. James Sullivan, a local physician with a practice on Essex Street, recorded in his private journal an unusual spike in house calls to the Hargrove estate starting in December of 1893. His entries, found decades later among a collection of medical ephemera, make special note of Margaret Hargrove's nervous condition and her growing fixation on sounds from the upper level. Sullivan prescribed various tonics and recommended rest, diagnosing her with female hysteria, a common explanation for women's ailments in that period. What is strange is that by February of 1894, Dr. Sullivan's regular visits stopped abruptly. When his colleagues asked about the Hargrove sisters, he would reportedly deflect the question or cite patient confidentiality. Multiple sources indicate he refused to set foot in the house again after his final visit on February 23rd. The Hargrove estate was set on 3 acres of land, partly wooded, with a small servants' quarters and a carriage barn behind the main house. The building itself was a 3-story Victorian, with a distinctive northeastern turret and a wraparound porch. Census records show that besides the sisters, the home was occupied by a cook, a maid, and a groundskeeper, all of whom would later give contradictory testimonies about what transpired within those walls. Martha Winters, the cook who had been with the family for over 15 years, left her job without notice in March of 1894. When interviewed by the Salem Gazette for an unrelated piece in 1900, she declined to discuss her former employers, stating only, "Some houses hold their secrets closer than others." What we can confirm is that on the morning of April 7, 1894, Eleanor Hargrove arrived at the Salem police station in a condition Officer William Brody described as one of severe distress. The official police report, one of the few documents to survive the later purge, notes that Miss Hargrove asked for help at her home concerning her sister Margaret, whom she claimed was not herself anymore. When the officers reached the estate, they discovered the front door slightly open and the house gripped by an unnatural quiet. Based on Officer Brody's personal account, retrieved from his grandson's attic in 1958, the officers announced themselves upon entry but got no answer. They found Eleanor Hargrove sitting in the parlor, staring vacantly at the wall, apparently unable or unwilling to offer further direction. The subsequent search of the house located Margaret Hargrove in the second-floor master bedroom. Officer Brody described her as perfectly composed, seated at her vanity, and arranging her hair, as if getting ready for a social event. When asked about her sister's worries, Margaret reportedly smiled and said, "Eleanor has always been inclined toward flights of fancy. Nothing is the matter here." The officers, finding no proof of a disturbance or any crime, had no option but to depart. They noted in their report that Eleanor seemed disappointed, though not shocked, by this result. As they were leaving, Officer Brody recalled Eleanor whispering, "She won't let you see the attic. She never does." The next week witnessed unusual activity at the Hargrove estate. Deliveries of lumber and other building supplies were noted, and a carpenter from Danvers was hired for what neighbors were told was standard upkeep. Frederick Jenkins, the groundskeeper, later told his wife, according to her diary found in 1912, that he had been ordered to refuse all visitors access to the property during this time. On April 22nd, smoke was seen coming from the chimney of the Hargrove mansion, which was odd for the season. A neighbor, Mrs. Catherine Lloyd, reported in a letter to her sister that she had never encountered such a sharp, acrid odor and that it had clung to her laundry drying outside. She wrote, "It wasn't the smell of wood or coal burning, but something else entirely, something I wouldn't dare name." By the end of April, both Hargrove sisters had returned to their usual routines in town. They attended church, made their customary social visits, and even held a small gathering for the Ladies' Aid Society. Those who saw them noticed nothing out of the ordinary, save for perhaps that they seemed more similar to one another than ever before. As one guest later remembered, it was as if they were mirror images. It was Reverend Thomas Blackwood who first expressed concern for the sisters' welfare. In his journal, he wrote of a confession Eleanor had made during a private meeting on May 3rd. The precise nature of this confession went unrecorded, but Reverend Blackwood noted he had urged her to seek more than spiritual counsel and that he had serious fears about the house's influence on both women. 3 days later, Reverend Blackwood asked the town doctor to join him at the Hargrove estate for what he termed a wellness check. They were greeted politely, but were not allowed past the foyer. Margaret assured them that she and Eleanor were in fine health, and that the Reverend had misinterpreted her sister's anxieties. As they were leaving, Reverend Blackwood reported hearing a noise like faint weeping from the upper stories. When he mentioned this to Margaret, she smiled and said, "The wind performs strange tricks in old houses, Reverend." The first week of May brought exceptionally heavy rains to Salem. On the night of May 7th, during a fierce thunderstorm, neighbors reported hearing terrible screams from the direction of the Hargrove estate. Albert Preston, whose farm bordered the property, later testified that he had spotted a figure in white moving in the highest window of the house, a window that, per the architectural plans, should have been part of an unfinished storage area, not a livable room. Preston, troubled by what he had seen, tried to visit the estate the next morning, but was sent away by the groundskeeper, who claimed the sisters were ill and not accepting visitors. Unconvinced, Preston reported his concerns to the police. Officer Brody, along with the town's new health inspector, called at the Hargrove estate on May 9th. They were received by both sisters in the parlor and found nothing outwardly wrong. When questioned about the reported disturbance, Margaret clarified that a window had been left open during the storm, causing a shutter to slam repeatedly against the house. As for the figure in white, she proposed it could have been a curtain stirred by the wind. The health inspector asked to see the upper floors, citing worries about potential water damage from the heavy rain. According to his report, which was filed with the town clerk and later removed, his inspection of the second floor revealed nothing unusual. When he asked about accessing the attic, Eleanor quickly interrupted, stating the space was just for storage and was currently unreachable due to a broken ladder. The inspector noted that both sisters grew visibly tense at the mention of the attic, and that Margaret's hand, which had been resting on her sister's arm, tightened so forcefully that Eleanor flinched. Still, with no grounds for a deeper investigation, the officials left, though Officer Brody later confided to a colleague that he had seen what looked like scratch marks on the inside of the parlor door, marks that aligned with fingernails, as if someone had been desperately clawing to get out. By mid-May, rumors about the Hargrove sisters began to spread through Salem. Some proposed that Eleanor was suffering from the same nervous affliction that had supposedly taken her mother, who spent her final years in a Boston asylum. Others whispered of strange deliveries to the house under cover of darkness, medical supplies, according to the local pharmacist's son, who claimed to have seen the parcels. The pharmacist in question, Harold Merritt, operated a small shop on Essex Street where he prepared medicinal compounds for the town's doctors. According to his business ledger, kept by his descendants and made available to researchers in 1946, The Hargrove household placed several unusual orders during this time. These included large amounts of laudanum, chloral hydrate, and other sedatives typically prescribed for severe insomnia or agitation. Most notable was an order placed on May 21st for items more commonly found in a hospital: bandages, surgical spirits, and enough plaster of Paris to make a full-body cast. When Dr. Sullivan questioned Margaret about these purchases, she reportedly explained they were assembling a care package for a cousin injured in a Connecticut railway accident. No record of such an accident exists in period newspapers, nor do family records mention any cousins in Connecticut. This inconsistency went unnoticed at the time, but emerged years later when the scattered case documents were assembled. It was during this period that Eleanor Hargrove ceased appearing in public entirely. Margaret explained her sister's absence as due to a lingering sickness requiring rest and solitude. She continued to attend social events alone, representing the family in Salem society with remarkable poise. Gertrude Hathaway, who worked as the Hargroves' maid during this time, later told her daughter, as recorded in the daughter's memoirs published in 1928, that she had been expressly prohibited from entering Eleanor's bedroom to clean or deliver meals. Miss Margaret said her sister was extremely sensitive to disruptions and needed absolute quiet, Hathaway recalled. All meals and necessities were to be left outside the door, and I was never to knock or try to speak with Miss Eleanor directly. Hathaway also observed a curious ritual that started in late May. Every evening at exactly 8:00, Margaret would go upstairs carrying a tray with tea and a small decanter that smelled strongly of medicine. She would vanish for about an hour before returning with the tray, often bearing untouched food, but always with an empty decanter. On June 2nd, a fire ignited in the servants' quarters behind the main house. While the blaze was quickly controlled and caused little damage, it brought the fire brigade onto the property. Thomas Collins, a volunteer firefighter, reported seeing movement in the highest window of the house as the brigade was packing its equipment. When he pointed this out to Margaret Hargrove, she reportedly stared at the window for a long moment before stating, "That's impossible. No one is up there." Collins later told his fellow firefighters that he had clearly seen a pale face pressed against the glass, though he admitted the distance, and poor light may have tricked his eyes. What he described with more certainty, however, was Margaret's reaction. "She didn't look surprised or puzzled," he said. "She looked frightened, and then she looked angry." In the days after the fire, Hathaway noticed increased activity on the third floor. In her daughter's account, she described hearing furniture being dragged around and the noise of hammering from the attic space. When she asked about the sounds, Margaret explained they were finally fixing damage from a roof leak that had happened the previous winter. The following Sunday, Margaret Hargrove attended church alone once more. After the service, she spoke with Reverend Blackwood, informing him that Eleanor had taken a turn for the worse and asking him to call at the house to offer spiritual comfort. The Reverend agreed to visit that afternoon. What happened during Reverend Blackwood's visit on June 5th remains largely a mystery. He never spoke publicly about what he witnessed inside the Hargrove home. His journal entries for the week after the visit are conspicuously absent, torn from the binding. The next intact entry, dated June 12th, contains only the cryptic remark, "Some sins cannot be absolved through confession alone. Some demand more permanent measures." Church records show that on June 6th, Reverend Blackwood requested an emergency meeting with the town's selectmen. The minutes from this meeting were later removed from the town archives, but a letter from one selectman to his brother in Boston, preserved in family papers, mentions a disturbing account given by the Reverend concerning the Hargrove household and a decision to investigate discreetly. Given the family's standing, no record of any such investigation exists in town files. However, the personal diary of Judge Henry Putnam, head selectman at the time, contains a brief entry dated June 9th, "Matter of H. Sisters resolved satisfactorily. RBS concerns unfounded. Case closed by unanimous decision." On June 15th, Margaret Hargrove announced to the Ladies' Aid Society that she and Eleanor would be traveling to Europe for an extended stay, hoping the change of climate would help her sister's health. She indicated they would leave within the week and had arranged for the house to be maintained in their absence. What makes this announcement especially suspicious is a discovery made years later of passenger manifests from all ships leaving Boston for European ports in the summer of 1894. Neither Eleanor nor Margaret Hargrove appears on any of these lists. Even more curious is a find made in 1917 when renovations to a Boston hotel revealed a trunk concealed in a sealed wall cavity. The trunk held women's clothing from the 1890s, including several dresses with the initials E.H. stitched on the collars. Also inside were train tickets to Montreal dated June 16, 1894, in the name of M. Harrington. The Hargrove estate, however, remained occupied. Lights were seen in the windows at night, and smoke occasionally rose from the chimneys. Frederick Jenkins, the groundskeeper, continued to maintain the property, though he now firmly turned away all visitors. When pressed by neighbors, he would only say that the sisters had left instructions for the house to be kept ready for their immediate return. Jenkins' wife, Mary, who sometimes helped with household duties at the estate, later told her sister in a letter dated August 1894 that she had heard strange noises from the upper floors at night. Like someone pacing back and forth, she wrote, and sometimes what sounds like two women talking, though one voice seems much weaker than the other. Mary Jenkins also reported an unsettling discovery she had made while cleaning. In a little used parlor at the back of the house, she found a mirror with what looked like practice sentences written on it in soap. "My name is Eleanor Hargrove, and I have always lived in Salem," repeated multiple times, each version slightly different in penmanship. Then, when she mentioned this odd find to her husband, he reportedly became agitated and warned her never to speak of it again. "He told me that Miss Margaret had taken an interest in handwriting analysis," Mary wrote, "but his face went so pale when he said it that I knew he wasn't telling the truth." In October of 1894, a traveling salesman passing through Salem reported a strange encounter. Having lost his way after dark, he approached the Hargrove estate to ask for directions. He claimed that as he neared the house, he saw a woman's face at an upper window, her mouth open in what seemed a silent scream. When he reached the front door and knocked, he was greeted by a woman who introduced herself as Margaret Hargrove. The salesman, finding this odd given the rumors of the sisters' departure, asked if they had returned from Europe. According to his account published in a Boston newspaper in 1900, the woman smiled strangely and replied, "I'm always here. It is Eleanor who comes and goes." When he mentioned the face he had seen at the window, she invited him inside for tea, insisting there was no one else in the house. The salesman, growing increasingly uneasy, declined and hurried away. As he glanced back at the house from the road, he claimed to see two identical female figures standing in the entrance hall, watching him leave. This account might be dismissed as the fabrication of a man seeking attention, were it not for a similar experience reported by Dr. Sullivan's replacement, Dr. Edward Pierce. Called to the Hargrove estate in November of 1894 to treat what the housekeeper described as a fall, Pierce found Margaret Hargrove alone in the parlor, seemingly unhurt. When he asked about the patient needing treatment, Margaret led him to a second-floor bedroom. According to a letter Pierce wrote to a medical colleague in Boston, preserved in the colleague's personal papers, the room contained a woman lying in bed, her face turned to the wall. "Mrs. Jenkins gave me to understand that Miss Eleanor had taken a fall," Pierce wrote. "But the figure in the bed made no movement or sound as I entered. When I tried to examine her, Miss Margaret intercepted me, saying her sister was sleeping and must not be disturbed." She then proceeded to describe symptoms, bruising, pain in the rib cage. With such precision, I found myself writing a prescription without having examined the patient at all. It was only as I was leaving that I realized the strangeness of what had happened. Pierce concluded his letter by noting that as he descended the stairs, he glanced back to see Margaret standing on the landing, whispering intensely to someone just out of sight. "I cannot shake the feeling," he wrote, "that I was deliberately prevented from confirming the identity of the woman in that bed, if indeed there was a woman there at all." Dr. Pierce's suspicions were apparently strong enough to prompt a second visit to the Hargrove estate the next day, ostensibly to deliver medication. This time he was met at the door by Eleanor Hargrove, who appeared in good health and claimed no knowledge of any fall or injury. When Pierce mentioned speaking with Margaret the previous day, Eleanor's expression reportedly changed. "She looked at me with what I can only call a moment of pure panic," Pierce wrote, before composing herself and saying, "My sister is confused at times. She worries unnecessarily about my health. When I asked to speak with Margaret directly, Eleanor told me she had gone to Boston for the day." As our conversation ended, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the floor above, though Eleanor insisted we were alone in the house. The winter of 1894 to 1895 was especially harsh in Massachusetts. Heavy snowfall isolated many homes, including the Hargrove estate. The people of Salem gave little thought to the sisters during this period, assuming they were still in Europe. One exception was Eliza Carter, whose property shared a northern border with the Hargrove land. In a letter to her daughter dated January 1895, Carter described seeing smoke from the chimneys of the Hargrove house during a blizzard. More disturbingly, she claimed to have seen a woman's figure in the garden one morning after a heavy snowfall, standing perfectly still among the dead rose bushes, wearing only a nightdress, despite the freezing temperature. When Carter called out to the figure, it reportedly turned toward her with an expression of desperate pleading before another woman appeared from the house, wrapped a blanket around the first woman, and led her firmly back inside. Carter, concerned by what she had witnessed, tried to visit the house later that day, but found the gates locked and received no answer to her calls. It wasn't until March of 1895 that Margaret Hargrove reappeared in town, attending a charity function at the town hall. She explained they had returned from Europe earlier than planned due to poor traveling conditions, and that Eleanor remained at home, still recovering from her illness. Those who met Margaret at this event described her as changed. She wore her hair differently, spoke more assertively, and displayed mannerisms some longtime acquaintances found unfamiliar. Most striking was her response when Reverend Blackwood inquired specifically after Eleanor's health. According to multiple witnesses, Margaret smiled oddly and replied, "Eleanor and I understand each other perfectly now. We are more alike than ever before." Reverend Blackwood, visibly disturbed by this encounter, tried to visit the Hargrove estate the next day but was turned away by the groundskeeper. A note in his journal reads, "I fear my earlier inaction has led to something irreversible. The woman who calls herself Margaret Hargrove is not the same person I knew last year. Something fundamental has changed, but whether in her appearance or her very nature, I cannot say with certainty." Throughout the spring and summer of 1895, Margaret Hargrove maintained a visible presence in Salem society. She attended all the appropriate functions, made the expected charitable donations, and even joined the town committee, organizing the Independence Day celebration. If anyone found it strange that Eleanor never appeared in public, they kept such opinions to themselves. One persistent rumor from this period involves a discovery made by a delivery boy in August. Bringing groceries to the Hargrove kitchen door, he reportedly glimpsed a woman locked in a pantry, her face pressed against the small window in the door. The boy described the woman as very thin, with short, unevenly cut hair and eyes that seemed too large for her face. When he asked Mrs. Jenkins about what he had seen, she allegedly burst into tears and begged him never to mention it to anyone. The boy's mother, concerned by her son's account, reported the incident to Officer Brody, who made a cursory inquiry at the estate, but found nothing amiss. In his report, he noted that Margaret Hargrove had been particularly accommodating, inviting him to inspect the entire ground floor of the house, including the pantry, which contained nothing but preserved foods. The Hargrove case might have faded into obscurity, becoming just another tale of eccentric spinsters, were it not for the events of September 18, 1895. On that evening, a violent thunderstorm struck Salem. Lightning reportedly hit the Hargrove estate, causing a fire that quickly engulfed the upper floors. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the roof had partially collapsed, and the blaze had spread to the second floor. Margaret Hargrove was found in the garden, soaking wet and seemingly in shock. When asked about her sister, she reportedly laughed and said, "Eleanor is where she has always been." As firefighters battled the blaze, a section of the attic floor gave way, revealing a space that, according to several witnesses, should not have existed. Fire existed. The architectural plans for the house showed no room in that location, only support beams and insulation. What was discovered in that hidden space has been systematically removed from all official records. The fire brigade's report for that night is missing from the town archives. The newspaper account of the fire omits any mention of unusual discoveries. Even the death certificate issued afterward refers only to remains recovered from the fire, with no indication of identity. However, personal accounts collected years later tell a different story. Thomas Collins, the same firefighter who had reported seeing a face at the highest window months earlier, confided to his son on his deathbed in 1931 that what they found in the attic of the Hargrove mansion was not something that should have been possible. According to this account, the hidden room contained evidence of long-term habitation, a bed, a chair, and various personal items. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be 2 sets of women's clothing, identical in every respect, laid out as if for inspection. Collins described scratch marks covering the inside of the door and walls, some deep enough to have splintered the wood and drawn blood, judging by the dark stains. Collins also claimed they found a collection of personal items arranged on a small table, hairbrushes holding different lengths of the same color hair, several pairs of gloves of slightly different sizes, and a notebook filled with handwriting exercises. The same phrase written over and over in progressively more similar styles. The phrase, according to Collins, was, "I am Margaret Hargrove." Most disturbing of all was Collins's description of a mirror positioned at the foot of the bed, angled so that anyone lying there would see their own reflection. The glass had been broken, but fragments remained in the frame. On the wall behind where the mirror had hung, someone had scratched a message into the plaster. "She is becoming me." Dr. Pierce was called to the scene to examine the remains found in the debris. His medical notes, which he kept separate from his official report, describe extensive evidence of restraint and prolonged confinement. He also noted unusual physical anomalies he could not readily explain, concluding only that the deceased had been subjected to conditions incompatible with normal human survival for an extended period. In a private letter to a former medical school colleague, Pierce elaborated on his observations. The body recovered from the attic room presented a most perplexing case. Though severely damaged by the fire, certain features remained discernible. The hands showed evidence of healing fractures, consistent with repeated trauma, possibly self-inflicted in attempts to escape confinement. More disturbing were the indications of deliberate alterations to the subject's appearance, crude attempts at surgical modification I hesitate to describe in detail. I am convinced that whoever this poor soul was, they had been systematically transformed both physically and psychologically over many months. Within days of the fire, Margaret Hargrove sold the ruined property to the town for a nominal sum and departed Salem. According to the bill of sale preserved in county records, she intended to return to England, the country from which the Hargrove family had originally emigrated 3 generations earlier. No record of her arrival in England has ever been found. Most remarkable about the Hargrove case is not just what happened, but how thoroughly it was subsequently erased from official memory. Within months of the fire, town officials had the ruins demolished and the land cleared. By 1897, a small public park occupied the site with no marker or indication of the property's former owners. Furthermore, a systematic removal of references to the case appears to have been undertaken. Police reports were redacted or destroyed. Newspaper archives from the period show signs of alteration. Even church records, normally meticulously kept, have suspicious gaps coinciding with key dates in the Hargrove timeline. This deliberate obscuring of history might have been completely successful were it not for the personal papers, diaries, and correspondence preserved by individuals with connections to the case. These scattered accounts, discovered over decades and pieced together, form the foundation of what we know about the Hargrove sisters and their mysterious attic. In 1910, a collection of personal effects belonging to Margaret Hargrove was discovered in a Boston storage facility, where they had apparently been kept since shortly after the fire. Among these items was a journal, its final entries dated just weeks before the fire that destroyed the Hargrove mansion. The journal, now part of a private collection and rarely accessible to researchers, reportedly contains disturbing insights into Margaret's state of mind during the final months at the estate. According to those who have examined it, Margaret wrote extensively about her sister Eleanor, describing her as changing and becoming something new. One frequently quoted passage reads, "Eleanor insists she hears someone moving in the attic. I have explained repeatedly that the sounds are merely the house settling, yet she persists in this delusion. Last night I found her at the attic door again, listening. When I asked what she heard, she turned to me with an expression I did not recognize and said, 'She's trying to get out, Margaret, just as I did.' I do not know what she means by this, but her manner disturbs me greatly." Later entries become increasingly erratic, with Margaret writing about the other Eleanor and keeping her secure. The final entry, dated September 15, 1895, 3 days before the fire, contains only the cryptic statement, "We are the same now." The journal also contains several pages of what appeared to be instructions or procedures written in a different hand and on older paper. These pages, apparently inserted rather than originally bound with the book, contain detailed notes on what is described as the transference of essence. While much of the text uses technical or possibly coded language, certain phrases stand out with disturbing clarity. Subject must be gradually prepared through isolation and disorientation. Mirror exercises essential to the process, and final phase requires complete submission, voluntarily or induced. A notation at the top of these pages indicates they were copied from grandfather's red book, a reference that aligns with family records showing that Thaddeus Hargrove's grandfather had been involved with certain esoteric societies in England before immigrating to America in the early 19th century. In 1912, Frederick Jenkins, the longtime groundskeeper of the Hargrove estate, was admitted to the state hospital in Danvers, suffering from what his doctors described as acute melancholia with paranoid features. During his confinement, he spoke repeatedly about his former employers, telling doctors and fellow patients that there were never just two Hargrove sisters, and that the attic held the truth. According to hospital records, Jenkins became particularly agitated when discussing the events of June 1894. "I helped her carry the body," he reportedly said during one session. "Not dead, no, but not fully alive either. We took her up the servants' stairs to the room. Miss Margaret had prepared. I didn't ask questions. The Hargroves had been good to me, and Miss Margaret said her sister was having one of her episodes and needed to be kept safe." Jenkins claimed that in the months that followed, he was responsible for bringing food to the attic room and removing waste, always under Margaret's supervision. "Sometimes I heard weeping from behind that door," he told a nurse. "Other times just whispers, like someone talking to themselves. Once I heard her say, 'I am still Eleanor,' over and over. Miss Margaret said it was just the illness talking." Most disturbing was Jenkins' account of the changes he observed in both sisters over time. "Miss Eleanor, the one downstairs, she started to change. Her voice became different. The way she walked, the way she held her teacup, more like Miss Margaret every day. And Miss Margaret, she seemed pleased by this. She would correct her sometimes, saying things like, 'No, Eleanor, that's not how you've always done it,' like she was teaching her to be herself." Jenkins died in the hospital in 1914, having never returned to Salem. His personal effects included a small key labeled HA, presumably for Hargrove Attic, though the door it might have unlocked had been destroyed years earlier. Perhaps the most revealing document related to the case emerged in 1920, when Reverend Blackwood's complete journals were discovered during renovations to the Salem church parsonage. The missing pages, which the Reverend had apparently removed and hidden separately, contained his account of his final visit to the Hargrove estate on June 5, 1894. According to this account, Blackwood was received by Margaret and led to a bedroom where Eleanor supposedly lay ill. When he entered the room, he found it empty. Confronting Margaret about this deception, she allegedly replied, "Eleanor is where she needs to be, where I put her." Alarmed, Blackwood demanded to know Eleanor's whereabouts. Margaret reportedly led him to the attic door, producing a key from her pocket. As she unlocked the door, she told him, "My sister has not been herself lately. She needed to be contained until she remembers who she truly is." What Blackwood claimed to have seen in the attic room haunted him for the remainder of his life. He described a space converted into crude living quarters with a bed, chamber pot, and small table. The windows had been boarded over from the inside, allowing only thin slivers of light to penetrate. Most disturbing was his description of Eleanor Hargrove, whom he found sitting in a corner of the room, her appearance so altered he initially failed to recognize her. According to Blackwood, Eleanor's hair had been roughly cut short, and she wore a nightgown soiled from extended wear. When she saw him, she reportedly showed no recognition, only whispering repeatedly, "She's trying to become me. She practices in the mirror." Blackwood's account continues with his confrontation of Margaret, who allegedly explained that Eleanor had begun to exhibit dangerous tendencies and required seclusion for her own protection. When he threatened to report this imprisonment to the authorities, Margaret's demeanor reportedly changed entirely. "She looked at me with such coldness," Blackwood wrote, "and said words I shall never forget. By the time you return with help, Reverend, you will find Eleanor downstairs taking tea in the parlor, perfectly composed and bewildered by your accusations. Who do you think they will believe? Two respected ladies of this town, or a minister known to harbor unnatural interests in the spiritual afflictions of vulnerable women?" Faced with this implicit threat to his reputation and the disturbing possibility he might not be believed, Blackwood made what he later described as the greatest moral failure of my life. He left the Hargrove estate without taking immediate action, intending to consult with town officials the following day. By the time he returned with the police on June 6th, he found exactly what Margaret had predicted. Eleanor seated in the parlor, perfectly groomed and apparently in good health. She expressed confusion at the Reverend's concerns and invited the officers to inspect the house, including the attic, which was found to contain nothing but usual household storage. Blackwood's journal entry concludes with a haunting observation. "As I left in humiliation, Eleanor took my hand and whispered something that chills me still. 'I am not who you think I am.' Whether this was a plea for help or a confession of some darker truth, I cannot say with certainty, but I believe now that the woman I saw in the attic and the woman who sat in the parlor the next day were both Eleanor Hargrove, and yet somehow they were not the same person." The Reverend died in 1916, his reputation in Salem somewhat diminished by what many perceived as an unhealthy obsession with the Hargrove case. His journals remained hidden until 1920, by which time most of the principals in the case had either died or disappeared. In his final years, Reverend Blackwood had repeatedly attempted to interest authorities in reopening an investigation into the Hargrove affair. His efforts were largely dismissed as the ravings of a man in declining mental health. However, among his personal effects was found a collection of carefully preserved newspaper clippings detailing missing persons cases across New England between 1895 and 1915. Each clipping had been annotated in Blackwood's handwriting, noting similarities in physical appearance between the missing women and Eleanor Hargrove. Most strikingly, several of these cases involved reports of a well-dressed, cultured woman seen in the vicinity shortly before the disappearance. And Blackwood had circled these descriptions and written in the margin, "M.H. still practicing her art." One such case from 1900 involved the disappearance of a librarian in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. According to witnesses, the woman had been engaged in conversation by a refined lady from Boston on the day she vanished. The description of this visitor, tall with auburn hair and an aristocratic bearing, matches known descriptions of Margaret Hargrove. Most disturbingly, the missing librarian was reported to bear a striking resemblance to Eleanor Hargrove in terms of height, build, and coloring. 6 months after this disappearance, a new resident arrived in a small town in Vermont, claiming to be the same librarian and explaining her absence as an extended visit to relatives. According to local accounts, however, acquaintances noted subtle changes in her demeanor and habits. She remained in the town for approximately 3 years before departing suddenly, leaving behind most of her possessions. Blackwood had connected this case with 5 others following a similar pattern across New England. In each instance, a woman disappeared, only for someone claiming to be her to reappear weeks or months later, changed in subtle ways that friends and family could not quite articulate. In each case, the reappearance was preceded by sightings of a woman matching Margaret Hargrove's description. One final piece of evidence emerged in 1919 when renovations to a building in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, uncovered a letter sealed in a wall cavity. The letter, dated October 1895 and signed M. Hargrove, was addressed to an unknown recipient. It read in part, "The procedure was more difficult than anticipated, but ultimately successful." The subject retained too much of her original identity at first, necessitating additional measures. The fire was regrettable, but necessary to eliminate all evidence. I am satisfied that no connection can be established between my former and current identities. The techniques documented in our grandfather's journals have proven effective, though the psychological component requires refinement. I look forward to discussing modifications for future application. The letter continued, "I have identified a promising candidate in Portsmouth who shares the required physical characteristics. Initial observations suggest a suitable psychological profile as well, intelligent but isolated, with few close connections to complicate the transition. I have established contact under the guise of research into local history and have been invited to her home next week. The groundwork has been laid carefully, with attention to the refinements we discussed after the previous attempt. I do not anticipate the same difficulties that arose with E." The letter was turned over to authorities in Portsmouth but was subsequently lost or destroyed before it could be properly investigated. Only a clerk's transcription remains, filed with miscellaneous historical documents in the city archive, and what actually transpired in the attic of the Hargrove mansion may never be fully known. The systematic removal of evidence, combined with the passage of time and the death of all directly involved parties, has left us with more questions than answers. What seems clear, however, is that something occurred that was disturbing enough to warrant an organized effort to erase it from public memory. Some historians specializing in New England history have suggested the case may have connections to certain esoteric practices allegedly brought to Salem by European immigrants in the mid-19th century. These practices, involving concepts of identity, transference, and psychological manipulation, were documented